Starting. Oh, there we go. Okay, recording has started. So good morning. Welcome everybody to the second technical working group on the Bergamot Objective Design Standards. Today we will be focusing on principles for taller buildings. But before we jump in, and some of you may not have joined us for the first one, so I think it's helpful just to do a round of introductions since we'll be spending the next 2 hours together. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Jing Yo. I'm the manager of the City Planning Division. And just for sake of time, I'll introduce the city team here. Rachel Kwok, Ross Furman, Stephanie Reich, Steve Mizukami, and Roxanne Tanamori are here from the city team. And then Susan Ambrosini from AECOM, who has been our consultant on this project, will be doing the lion's share of the presentation today. And I'm just going to start based on the list that I see in the attendees. So Bob Taylor, I believe that's you. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Bob.
You're muted, Bob.
Maybe I can unmute him. I cannot unmute him.
There you go. I think
there we go.
it.
Okay.
Okay. So Bob Taylor, architect, Ocean Park resident, longtime activist resident in the community.
Thank you. Welcome. Brandon Klein.
Hi, I'm with Madison, ownership in the community.
Thank you. Danny O'Shea. Danny? Oh. Danny O'Shea? I see you there. I'm not sure he hears me, though. All right, I'm going to move on to George Gleason.
Hi, George Gleason. I am a developer and a resident of Wilmot. I've lived here for the last decade plus.
Welcome. Danny, I see you've unmuted.
Hi, I'm Danny O'Shea with Project Management Advisors. We're a development advisor.
Thank you. Jeremy Bamberger.
Morning, everybody. Jeremy Bamberger, architect with SCB.
Power
and
Block?
resident of Ocean Park, I suppose.
Thank you. Power Block.
Good morning, everybody. I'm an architect at DFH Architects in Santa Monica.
Great. Mario Fonda Bernardi.
I'm an architect too, and also former planning commissioner.
Michael Weinstone. Michael, do we have you? Oh, we'll come back to you. Robert Windmiller.
Good morning, everyone. Robert Windmiller with Madison, ownership member in the community.
All right, welcome. Sam Tolkien.
I'm an architect and current planning commissioner.
Great. Sarah Kennedy.
Hello, good morning. My name's Sarah Kennedy. I'm an architect at SCB.
And Strachan Forgan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Well done. Perfect. Yeah, architect at SCB as well.
Great. And Zach Caden. Zach?
Yeah, sorry. Hey, everyone. A property owner in the area.
Great. And I'm going to come back to Michael Weinstone again. Going once, twice. Okay, maybe we'll hear from you later. I hope I didn't miss anybody on the list. I was just kind of going down based on what I'm seeing. I guess with that, let's fire up the presentation, Stephanie, and let's get started.
Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen, yeah. So let's go on to the next slide. So again, welcome to the working group today. Today we will be focusing on, like I said, principles for taller buildings. Some of the background for what precipitated this session is we have 4 preliminary applications that have been filed for taller buildings in the Bergamot area that are using new provisions under state density bonus law. They're sort of in the kind of like 24-story range. I do want to note, because those are preliminary applications, any new standards that we develop will not affect those proposed projects, but they are informative for the discussion. But they are vested in the standards, that we have today. And I want to note that our zoning ordinance currently doesn't include standards that address buildings of that scale. We haven't seen buildings proposed like this, for quite some time, I would say decades in the city. And so, it's kind of not addressed in our zoning ordinance. And so that's why we are introducing this discussion today. I want to note, we don't have anything set in stone or haven't really developed standards. And, this is truly an introduction. It's very much a informative session today. We're looking for some, very high level feedback on some approaches that we'll be sharing today. So you can see our meeting objectives. Like I said, it's the introduction of these principles, establishing objectives, so outcomes, like what is it that we want to achieve out of these buildings, and what standards would potentially support that. AECOM today will be reviewing really different approaches from various cities who obviously have taller buildings, have experience in this arena, and it's helpful to sort of learn what they've done, what the outcomes have been. We will be reviewing analysis of sun and wind considerations for Bergamot area. We've heard from this group and from the ARB as well an interest in sort of like performance standards. And so, we've kind of done a dive into that just to, again, share what we've learned with the group. And then we will obviously have plenty of time for some discussion questions that we have for this group. I want to note that, we have 2 hours together today. I think we anticipate that, we're likely not going to get through everything. I think we'll kind of see how it goes. We expect to hold another session, sort of date to be determined, with this group, as we work through this issue, because again, today is really just about the introduction of these ideas. Next slide. Just for the next slide, Stephanie. For the benefit of everyone, the Bergamot area plan, just some background, in terms of the project. So the Bergamot area plan was adopted September 2013, so over 10 years ago. And it was, of its time and place. It was intended to encourage a mixed-use, transit-oriented development around Bergamot Station. It wasn't just solely a housing focus. It was very much based around, the creative arts, references to the sort of, former industrial past of the Bergamot area. But, we fast forward to today, and it's really not resulted in the transformation, that was expected out of the plan. And that's really been for a variety of reasons, that hasn't come to fruition. And so, where we are today is, through the housing element process and kind of not seeing, that plan kind of develop in the way that's expected. Council directed through the housing element process, creating more incentives for the production of housing. And I think one of the, barriers that we've certainly heard from applicants that have tried to propose projects in the Bergamot area plan is that the standards are rather confusing. They're very difficult to implement. The community doesn't understand them very well. It's hard for developers to understand them. And, from a staff perspective, there's just not, it really behaves, not like the regular zoning code. So, really the core of this project is creating clear, objective, user-friendly standards, that still achieve the outcomes that we want. We spent a lot of time over the last probably year and a half or so talking through a lot of those objective design standards. And so the focus today is developing, starting the process of developing standards for these taller buildings, which have been, more recent in the progress in the Bergamot area. Next slide. So our agenda today, this is just a high-level overview. Don't try to memorize everything on the slide. We'll be walking the group through this. So, we're just in the introduction here. I'm just giving the project background. AECOM, Susan Ambrosini from AECOM, we were walking through sample standards from other cities. So that's the sort of different approaches, in a study of how other cities have dealt with tall buildings. And then we'll be ending on analysis and considerations for the Bergamot area with respect to shade, wind considerations, and the local conditions. Next slide, please. Before we jump into looking at those sort of diverse approaches, I think it's helpful to level set as to kind of why we are even looking at developing standards. And it's, really the intent is to create these, again, they have to be objective standards for new residential development that addresses the unique aspects of the Bergamot area. And I think you can see here sort of 5, major topic areas that we want to address through these. And, I kind of look at these as what are the objectives, they're sort of like, what are the outcomes we want to achieve? And then working backwards on whether the standards actually get there. So like, you've heard us say shadow and wind. We have analyzed shadow wind impacts on public streets and spaces. There's an intent to maximize cross ventilation and sunlight opportunities in any future development. We, I think, want to see development that create successful common open spaces within those new developments, where there is required open space on site. Are there standards we could develop to make sure that those are placed in sort of optimal locations, that provide, the appropriate amounts of sun and shade, so they're sort of like usable, and improve the quality of life for the residents that are on site. And with respect to buildings like this, it's not just the upper levels, but obviously the ground floor matters. And, the objective standards that have been developed thus far, very much have a focus on that level in terms of the ground floor, open space and pedestrian pathways, and ensuring pedestrian-oriented design. So you'll see some ideas around that, maybe not too dissimilar to the conversations that we have already been having with respect to those focus areas. So with that context, I'm now going to turn it over to Susan to walk through these approaches and sample standards from other cities. Susan?
Thank you, Jane. All right, next slide, please. So for the next handful of slides, I'm going to walk through these sample standards from other cities. We're not, just to reiterate, these are not recommended standards at all. We haven't started that process yet and wanted to get feedback from you today first, as well as the ARB. So today we're just walking you through what other cities have done that have these types of standards in place. Next slide. So a fundamental question needs to be, if you are going to have standards, is when do high-rise standards apply? And the reason why cities have created separate standards is it's generally different building typologies with different types of impacts that differ from low and mid-rise regulations. Obviously, high rises are more prominent in the city. They contribute to the city's skyline. So the things we're thinking about are slightly different than a typical structure that might be 5, 6, 7 stories. So other cities have defined high rises differently, which makes sense. They have different contexts. So here's a sampling. You can see downtown LA, high rises are over 14 stories. Same with Long Beach and San Diego, it's 11 stories. And San Jose, they have what they call the skyline level, which is over 6 stories. So in thinking about what that might be for Bergamot, we can think about the existing context. For example, the maximum height right now in Bergamot would be approximately 84 feet. And, certainly if buildings are going to be 16 or 20 stories, that's a significant jump from that. So creating separate standards would likely make sense. Just for a reference point, from a fire code perspective, high-rise height is 55 feet. The city might be open to changing that in the future. It doesn't need to match the high-rise height by any means, but it's a good reference point to kind of think about how these standards might interact with other building codes or other standards, just to make it really easy for folks to understand. Next slide. So typically design standards in other cities are looking at tower massing. That's one of the fundamental things. The general focus of these tower standards are to limit massing at upper levels. to support access to light and air and maintain views of the sky. So some sample standards that have been used are ground floor setbacks, upper floor setbacks, a sky exposure plane, height to width ratios, and floor plate maximums. So the diagram on the right shows a sky exposure plane. Next slide. So each of these standards obviously have slightly different things that they're trying to achieve. So on the right, for example, you see New York sky exposure plane. So really the intent here is to get sunlight to the street. So they actually have different standards depending on if it's a narrow street or a wide street. And they have different alternative ways of achieving the sky exposure plane. So I won't go into all the details, but I think you can get the sense of the massing being reduced as you go higher with the intent of getting more sunlight to the street. Another way of looking at massing too is height to width ratios in downtown LA. So that's with the intention to reduce the overall massing. So towers would have a ratio of height to width of about, in this case, 3.5 to 1. And so the nice thing about this is it can scale depending on how tall the building is, in terms of how much the massing is reduced. So that's one way of looking at it. Next slide. So another way of achieving limiting the massing is floor plate maximums. So this is relatively common. Certainly it's important tower floor plates drive the external massing. They are tied to project viability, so it's important to be thoughtful when creating these maximums. Some sample standards in Vancouver, for example, they have actual maximum widths between 70 and 80 feet. The floor plate size is up to 5,500, which is quite small. In contrast, you see San Diego, they have a maximum floor plate size of 21 or 22,000, depending on the height. So that's a real range. In part, that probably reflects the difference in the function of the tower. So in Vancouver, you're seeing more of the residential towers. In San Diego, you're seeing residential towers, but also commercial towers too. So certainly the floor plate is very, very much influenced by the use. And in Bergamot, we're specifically looking at towers for commercial projects would not be allowed. So we're specifically looking at residential towers. So that's something we would need to consider when setting a floor plate maximum if the city pursues that. So one of the general questions we have for this group is, should there be floor plate maximums or floor to height ratio or other means of regulating massing? Next slide. So here's just a visual example of Vancouver, how you can see the relatively small floor plates and the generous separation of towers and kind of what that cumulative effect would be. Not that this is the direction that Bergamot would be going with these numerous towers, but it just gives you a sense of how the different standards can influence the built form. Next slide. Thank you. So another area that standards, high-rise standards often include tower separation and placement standards. So for example, here, this is from downtown LA, the intention is to allow light and air between buildings, also to influence, wind tunnel effects and things like that. But as shown here, an example standard is that a portion of the tower above 150 feet, or the portion, I should say, shall be spaced at least 80 feet from all existing or possible future towers. So this diagram actually shows an example of an existing tower on a neighboring parcel and having to have spacing between that tower. So it's not just if you have multiple towers on a development, but it actually also triggers that requirement for neighboring parcels. And it also gets at ways to deal with, for example, curved or angled towers. So it's not just 80 feet, but it's 80 feet average to allow for more flexibility in the tower form. Next slide. So Long Beach, downtown LA, Vancouver, they all have an 80-foot minimum tower spacing requirement. So that seems pretty consistent, interestingly, across cities. New York City's is a little bit different. The tower spacing, maybe not surprisingly, is less. And it also is contingent on whether you're wall to wall, wall to window, or window to window. Next slide. So another thing that some standards have looked at is facade design. This can be a little bit trickier to make objective, but the considerations here are that high-rise prominence contributes to a city's identity. It creates visual interest. The facade design can or cannot create visual interest. So some sample standards could be around requiring balconies, requiring modulation, which if you're familiar with the downtown plan, there's a modulation requirement. So there could be a variation of that would be adopted for high rises, or things like including the use of vertical elements every, for example, 15 feet. How to kind of define that vertical element gets important when you're trying to make them objective. But these are some ways that cities can address avoiding flat towers if that's something the city is interested in pursuing. Next slide. Here are just some examples of facade designs in the general height range. Not exactly, some of these towers are taller in Brooklyn here, but it gives you a sense of the facade design. So they're often relatively flat, but architects have dealt with modulation in different ways. So in Brooklyn, you see these large masses, but then are modulated more holistically. Then you have subtle articulation, which is shown on the left. So the modulation isn't as significant, but they use these vertical elements or horizontal elements to add a little bit of articulation. Next slide. Here's some other examples. So what's pretty common in like downtown LA, San Diego, Vancouver too, is to integrate balconies into residential towers and other horizontal elements. And this is a way of breaking up the massing too. The center examples from Vancouver. So that's a very creative way to integrate modulation, so to speak, and articulation and varied colors and materials within the facade. And then our downtown building on Grand Street, the Gary building, that uses these individual, different components of the facade, modulated as well in material variation. So the other thing that we need to think about with high-rise design is the podiums that they often sit on. Not necessarily, but in many cases they do. So some things we need to consider are that podium massing can establish or continue a street wall at the pedestrian level. Some podiums cover almost entire lots, so there may be a need to break up excessively long ground floor massing, also related to allowing open space at the street level or pathways through the site. So when you have a podium that has lot coverage of the entire lot, there's many examples where there aren't pathways through, and if that's something that we're interested in focusing on in Bergamot, definitely needs to be considered for the podium level of high-rise design. So thinking about whether podium floor plate maximums different than the high-rise portion of the building, how we can use those potentially or break requirements for limiting lot coverage or requiring these spaces for pathways or open space. Next slide. So these are some ways that other cities have dealt with podium massing. These examples here are from San Jose. So they have street wall requirements, similar to what you might see in non-high-rise structures where you have a certain percentage that are required to be at the street. But then when you get to higher levels, then those same requirements do not apply. So it's really specific to the podium level. This also shows a standard that requires the building massing facing the public space to be visibly articulated to try to break up the heavy massing at the podium level. Next slide. So here's some photos showing open space and pathways in various different developments. So some considerations when we're thinking about open space in high-rise buildings is that the common open space is likely to occur very often on podiums, sometimes on the ground floor. It's also relatively common on rooftops too. So the ground floor and podium footprint maximums are something that could help support the ground floor open space and pathways. These photos show different configurations, which are interesting to look at. So on the left, we have an example from Vancouver. So we see a very large podium. So this is what I was referring to before, where if you implement this on a large block, it can make pedestrian circulation more challenging. But you can see the podium offers a large space for common open space within the site. The center picture is from downtown LA, the South Park neighborhood. So another example of a podium that that does not allow pathways through the site, but that is used for pretty significant recreational and open space. Then you have two tower examples from San Diego, which are more permeable, so they're not sitting on one giant podium, and it allows for some open space at the ground level. Next slide. So just a couple more here before we get into some more Bergamot specific thoughts. Solar access. So obviously when buildings are taller, they have more shadow impacts. So thinking about what kind of standards we might want to do here. There's several examples of cities using requiring shade studies to limit too much shade, particularly during the winter months. So that's something the city could look at. So the considerations really are the time of year and the time of day to protect spaces, maximizing sun and public spaces, especially during winter hours, and the siting of development and massing. So here are some example standards. The ones on the right are shown from San Jose. In San Diego, for example, they must maintain adequate sunlight and air to designated areas of Little Italy, which is the lower scale neighborhood adjacent to the downtown area during the winter solstice between these set hours. And then in Sydney, for example, identified open spaces must retain a minimum of 3 hours of solar access to at least 50% of the space between the hours of 9 and 3 on December 21st. So an important thing to think about is what are the spaces that you're trying to protect in terms of the shadow impacts. So in the Bergamot area, we don't have a particular public park or open space necessarily. So it's really thinking about other public open spaces like along the street and the streetscape, as well as on-site open spaces and how that impacts the public space that the development is building. Because ideally we want successful public or successful common open spaces on site too that are used by the residents of the building. Next slide. So finally here, we're looking at wind. So this does become more of a consideration with high-rise buildings. What we'd like to do is maximize ventilation for residential units, preserve wind flow, mitigate vertical wind effect, which is shown here on the diagram on the right, and mitigate wind effects on public streets and spaces. So you can typically do this through wind studies, which can be more complicated. So trying to figure out how we might be able to create objective standards that don't trigger a wind study for every project that comes through. So some ways that we can do this are to stagger the height and location of tall buildings in and between blocks to avoid blocking wind flows, to allow preserve that wind flow to adjacent streets and parcels. Another way this can be dealt with is gaps in the width and the podium level massing and the prevailing wind direction. Orient the widest skyline level building dimension within 30 degrees of the prevailing wind direction. So anyways, these are some examples of how the city might try to create some objective standards related to wind. Next slide. So now in the second half, we're going to talk a little bit about specific wind and solar considerations in Bergamot. So we did some cursory studies to provide you with some background context and information about what the local conditions are here that might influence the discussion. So we looked at the impacts of building placement and orientation on solar access, looking at on-site open space and public streets, and we'll highlight the impact of wind and breeze when buildings are placed to maximize solar access. So, we want to look at if we're optimizing building placement for solar, what impact that might have on wind, for example, and we're wanting to develop an understanding of opportunities to use these types of standards to minimize downdraft, which happens when the prevailing wind hits the facade of tall buildings. Next slide. So here are the local conditions, which many of you are likely very familiar with. So the prevailing wind comes from the southwest. So it is perpendicular and parallel with the grid. Because the grid pattern is at about a kind of 40-degree rotation from an exact north-south east-west alignment, it ends up aligning with the prevailing winds. Next slide. So here are 4 sites that we looked at to do, technically 3 sites with 4 different scenarios for the shade, shadow, and wind testing. So site number 1 that we looked at, kind of a medium-sized parcel directly adjacent to some multifamily residential. Site 2A is a 2-tower configuration, not on podium like site 1. And we looked at 2 different placements of one of the towers so that we could get a sense of the impact on on-site open space. And then site number 3 is based on a recent preliminary application that's come in the Bergamot district to get a sense for what the impacts of a development similar to that might be. Next slide. So looking at site number 1, this is just a closer view from the northwest on the left and from the southeast on the right, the same structure. Next slide. So here's the shadow study. On the top row is the winter, on the bottom row is the summer. So obviously very different in terms of the shadow impacts. So you can see here that you get a pretty long shadow in the morning that impacts the adjacent residential and the neighboring street. But then pretty quickly, within a couple hours, the shadow shifts to off the street towards the interior of the district, and then continues to shift at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If you're looking at the on-site open space, for example, this is a configuration of podium level open space. You can see that if you're on the northwest corner of the site, you're pretty much in the sun all day long. If you were to put an open space on the southeast portion of the site, you'd be in the shade most of the day. So it just helps us think about where the best location might be for on-site open space. So certainly, sun is great a lot of the time, but obviously sometimes in the summer you want to be in the shade too. So it's not necessarily saying that you want to be in the sun 100% of the time, but just understanding what the shadow impacts are. So you can see in the summer, it's much more minimal, but you get more shading at the early hours of the morning, at least in the on-site open space areas. All right, so moving on to site 2A and 2B, as I mentioned, this is the same site with slightly different tower configurations to get a sense of the tower impacts. Next slide. So this is in the winter hours for both. So just comparing site 2A and 2B, you can see when you have a tower that's sitting on the more southern portion of the site, you get the shadows in the morning through noon, and then they shift by the time you get to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. If you have more of that south-facing open space, not surprisingly, you get more sunlight for a good portion of the day in the morning, noon, and it's not really until the late afternoon that you start to get more of a shadow in that space. Next slide. So this is the summertime shadow impacts. So as you can see, they're most significant in the morning and then late in the afternoon. Next slide. So then we're looking at this third site, which we said is based on a preliminary application that the city got. Here you can see that the buildings are quite close together, so you don't have that spacing. Next slide. So here you can see the significant shadow impacts because the structures are quite close to each other. The shadow really becomes kind of one mass as it slowly goes across the neighboring parcels. So looking at it in the morning, you can see you get a significant shadow on the neighboring boulevard and to the parcels across the street. It moves quite slowly across the sky at noon and then at 3 p.m., it's starting to, shift towards the east as the sun is setting. You can see too, if you're looking at if the common open spaces were to be sitting within these towers, you can see that in the wintertime, they're in the shade all day. In the summertime, you get kind of little slivers of sun. But again, because of the separation, the sun access is relatively minimal, depending on where this space was located. Next slide. So then finally looking at wind. So wind behavior is not quite as consistent as solar for modeling impacts. Depending on the orientation, building massing can increase or decrease wind impact. Bergamot's grid is the parallel orientation to the prevailing wind. So it presents contrasting effects of wind. So for example, when we look at site 1, the tower spacing allows the wind to pass through the site, which is great in terms of wind access for neighboring parcels. The tower separation would need to be considered to avoid a wind tunnel effect. For site 2A and B, there is less wind passing through the site. There's more deflection happening. And so looking at mitigation effects where the facade is directly facing the prevailing wind will be important in terms of vertical wind effects. Next slide. And then finally looking at site 3. So as you can see, very little wind is able to pass through the site. There's likely a wind tunnel effect through the narrow spaces where it can pass through the site. On the leeward side, which is the eastern side here, there's potentially turbulent with disruptive airflow. The windward side, the downdraft would require mitigation. So because there's a lot of facade directly facing the prevailing winds, you'll get the vertical wind effect. So mitigation would be really important in this case. Next slide. So that's it in terms of information that we're sharing today. Now we'd like to shift gears and hear from you all. So in terms of what we're looking at, just to recap at a high level, feedback in general on design standards for towers, when you think high-rise standards should apply, and then your reaction to the sample standards from other cities. For example, should there be standards to limit massing for taller buildings? Should there be a maximum floor plate dimension or area? Should there be requirements for tower spacing or for facade articulation? Should there be additional standards at that podium level? And or should there be standards for tower placement related to solar and or wind ventilation performance? So with that, I will hand it back to Jane or others from the city team, and we can get the conversation going.
Great, thank you, Susan. So I think at this point, we're going to open it up to the group, and I want to encourage using the raise hand function, I think, which worked really well last time. It helps us order kind of, who to call on next. But the first question on there really, if we can go back to slide, which one is it? Slide 5, I believe, Stephanie. And I think we're looking for, go back one more, slide 5. The one with the design objectives. Keep going back. There we go. Yeah. So these are sort of the objectives or outcomes, that we're looking for, and in shaping the standards or influencing that. And I think first question is to the group: do these make sense? Any feedback, reactions, thoughts you have to the establishment of these objectives for taller buildings?
Oops.
Oh, hold on. There we go. Sounds like these are fine. Great. Okay.
So maybe maybe we want to just go through sort of the things that we presented one by one.
Yeah, no, I'm getting to that.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so the second one was, when should the high-rise standards apply? That's this question here. And And you can see the idea here was, should we create a sort of a height, if you will, when these new standards would apply, like buildings over X feet, and the reasoning here, these are different building typologies, and should there be one? Cara, go ahead. I think you're muted, Cara, if you're talking.
Sorry about that. I was. You think I should know by now. We do have a question with regards to this chart. So are these high-rise standards based on the building code standards, or because I know in downtown Los Angeles or in LA, your building is considered a high-rise when it's at 78 feet, and that's based on the fire department. And once you have go over that height limit, then that's when you have to do things like have pressurized stairs and stuff like that. So in Santa Monica, it is 55 feet, which that's when those enhanced design standards or fire life safety standards do pick up or do go into effect. So even a lot of our mid-rise buildings are affected by certain high-rise standards. So that's what I'm kind of confused about here is, I think what you're asking is when these potential shade and wind studies might be required, but what defines this high-rise limit?
So
Yeah.
I can, Jane, do you want to go? Or,
Go ahead.
Yes, so there are fire life safety standards, like you say, that kicks in, I think in, as you were saying, in Los Angeles, it's 75 feet, Santa Monica, it's 55 feet. These are different because we're looking at, we're asking the group if towers should be regulated with design standards that would shape the massing and placement and spacing between towers, et cetera. And we'll go through those one by one again with you. And, it seems like it may, so San Jose has it over 70 feet, so that may align with the building standards, but we're thinking that the design standards would be at a different height. As you can see in the chart, downtown Los Angeles has their tower design standards kicking in at 14 stories or over 150 feet. San Diego is 11 stories or over 125 feet. So it's a difference between the fire and life safety standards, where you would have the fire suppression systems and a different building type. And these would modulate the design, the shape, potentially the shape, position of the actual tower itself.
Right, but I'm just having a hard time understanding when these would go into effect because the current draft of the Bergamot Objective Design Standards has the transitional height and building step backs. So wouldn't those apply anyways? And it seems like the diagrams on this one had modified transitional heights, for lack of a better term. So
Yeah,
that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, we would probably be looking at reshaping that, and this is the start of that conversation. So we're wondering if we have tower standards of this type, when they should apply.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have any thoughts on that yet. I'm trying to digest, so thank you for that.
No, that's actually a helpful comment given where we've been, in developing these standards is, the overlap. And I think as we were thinking through this, particularly at the podium level, we were recognizing that there's a lot of overlap with the work that's already been done in terms of pedestrian orientation and ground floor. But with respect to, as you're thinking about the sort of like, what was formerly sort of the maximum area, I think, that's a helpful point to make in terms of whether these are a replacement of that or, how they melt together. I see
Yeah, I'll just-
Joe.
I was
Oh,
going to
sorry,
add
go
really quickly, just for context, the other standards were really designed to think about buildings that were within the current height limit. But the challenge the city has now is that they're getting applications that are significantly higher. And so that's why it requires this additional kind of layer of thinking about standards for towers.
Joe, you raising your hand, is that right? Or Jo?
Yeah, this is
okay.
Sorry, Jesse. This is Jesse.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
Sorry
Okay,
about
sorry.
that. Yeah. I'm like an unknown user on my thing. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. So as you know, since we've done a few of these applications, and actually the site 3 was a project that we had submitted for in the Bergamot area that was being analyzed, and I think one of the things with that is that we were. At the time, this was all early on, we were trying to keep the buildings as low as possible. And as we were working through it, you're realizing that the taller and slenderer the building, the better the shade and shadow and some of these other things work out, because you can't really translate, having worked on quite a few projects in Santa Monica, at the 8-story courtyard building and a lot of the courtyard requirements and what you can build in wood, it doesn't translate to concrete as soon as you get up a couple more stories higher. So I think in terms of like when these standards should kick in, is that we're realizing that somewhere around like the above 10 stories, definitely above 12 stories, that the shape of the building really does need to be different to be efficient, to be economical, and to pencil for developers wanting to build housing. So I think that's when these towers and sort of a whole different design idea comes into play for how we treat these. And I think that site, that example 3 project is a perfect example of that. Those were like a courtyard building and trying to get to certain heights and certain heights next to the neighbors, but it has significant impacts on some of the other quality of life issues that you come into play. So I think when we switch to towers and really think about what that is, then these standards, I think, need to come into play. So for me, I think that what LA and San Diego have somewhere in there makes a lot of sense, because that's when really the construction type and the form of the building does need to change.
Is there something tied to the building code, particular height or particular floor when the building type needs to change, or you're just talking about feasibility and economy?
It's both, but over 85 feet, that's going to be the limit of a wood construction. So if there's a 9-story, 10-story building, then they automatically need to change to a type 1 concrete construction. And you can get a construction of that type and to still kind of work with a courtyard building to some degree on those, like if you're just a couple more stories. But once you get up above, say, 10 stories, you really need to be looking at more efficient floor plates and going more to an internal circulation elevator core structure for the project.
Right. So you're suggesting 10 or 11 stories, or maybe 12 stories. And would you say that the 84-foot height might be a little too low for those standards to kick in?
Yeah, I would say that seems a little low still at 84 feet, because you could still, depending on like giving flexibility, there could be certain floor plate ratios and sizes and shapes of the building that could work above 84 feet in concrete that won't work at, say, 120 feet or certainly 150 feet.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think Mario had his hand raised. Mario,
Yeah.
did you want to get in?
I have a question. We did see some 80-foot separations between buildings. Maybe Susan, you can tell us, is that a number based on lot size? Where does that number come from? Or is it based on some other criteria?
Yeah, so you're right that the tower spacing decision is very important based on the typical lot sizes in an area. So like the example we showed for site 1, it was a smaller site. And so I think the tower spacing was about 50 feet. In these areas like Vancouver, downtown LA, the block sizes are quite large and the developments are pretty large. And so having an 80-foot tower spacing is kind of feasible in those areas. So as we move into the next stage of thinking about what we would recommend, definitely looking at the lot size and how that relates to what might be feasible. If you're trying to do 2 towers versus when you might just do the 1 tower and how that relates to the floor plate size, for example. But yeah, we didn't look at specifically, we didn't do an assessment of lot size in those particular areas and how that might have impacted the 80 feet, but presumably it was influenced significantly by the types of sites in those downtown areas.
So, and then one other idea, we actually talked about it at our first workshop, was the idea of the daylight planes and maybe not having daylight planes on the south and southeast and southwest, but only having them on the north, northwest, or northeast as a way of allowing buildings that are north of the subject property to get a little more daylight plane. So the daylight plane is tuned to which way the building is oriented. I think that would be a valuable addition. And then the last thing I would like to add, and I don't know if we're going in the right direction here, but we have to face this. Some buildings, because you're going to have very different sized buildings next to each other, some will be very small existing buildings, and some will be bigger. Some buildings may not be able to meet the photovoltaic requirement of our city, which is very modest. But when a big, huge ass building goes in next to you, you're basically locked out of that way of getting your power. And so there has to be some way of recognizing that. And I'll throw out some ideas. One of the ideas is that your building might have to provide a capacity for batteries and battery storage as one of the let's say contributions to the energy balance of this area. But we have to have that discussion, because at a certain point we're going to be running into those collisions between the energy needs of the city or of the specific plan. And it may be something that doesn't apply to the whole city, maybe just applies to the area where we have these tall buildings, or maybe something that works for the whole city. And we might as well start having that discussion now and maybe use the specific plan as to a way to road test the ideas that we're inevitably going to be, they sound crazy today, but in 5 or 10 years, when we're fighting for our global warming lives, these ideas will become very important. In other words, we don't want to be designing standards for buildings that are basically, let's say, obsolete on the moment they are designed. We know these things are coming, so we have to design for that.
I see Samuel's hand up. Thank you, Marian.
Yeah, my concerns are, of course, we need separations like this 80 feet. This might be ideal in certain places, but why haven't we done, given the ownership pattern and given the lot sizes and stuff, why haven't we done some sort of urban plan for the whole thing based on the new fact that we're getting submissions of many more stories than were originally envisioned for this area. The city owns some property, individuals owning. It seems to me it's a crapshoot right now about what we're going to get. And I think the city has an important role in this, in terms of really more identifying the urban design of this whole area and what it's going to look like, and then allowing developers to fill in some of those areas depending upon the ownership. We're not doing any of that, it seems. I mean, just providing standards, we're going to get some tall buildings on some sites. Whether they work or not is, whether there looks like it's all going to be residential, because there's not the big demand for office. It seems to me missing something here, which is a master idea of what this area should look like, given the transit line, which is a major backbone of the area. I mean, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, I can take a,
Oh.
okay, go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, so I think just to address, the desire for a master plan. So there is, like, that is what the Bergamot area plan is, and it's a derivative of the loose. So this sort of like overall city vision of, encouraging new development around the spine. At the time the loose was created, this was actually predated the expo line. So using, where the expo comes down to the city was definitely a guiding principle in terms of, what then was recommended in the loose in terms of policy and what have you. For the Bergamot area plan, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation and the background, we're not proposing to change, I think, the sort of underlying principles and the idea of, a community built around the expo station and having it be transit oriented. I think that's exactly why we're here. It's 10 years on, and we've seen none of that vision develop. And I didn't really delve into, the many reasons why that is, but I do want to make clear there is not a master landowner here. I'll use the city of just Vancouver as an example, simply because I grew up there. What you see there is, on the waterfront, it was one master landowner that owned hundreds of acres, right? So there was a lot of control. You're dealing with one entity. And Bergamot, the ownership pattern is very there's a lot of owners in the area. There's not just one owner, so you're dealing with many, many owners at different stages, of where they are in owning the land, what they want to do with it, So in terms of the city's role in this, right, what we can set as sort of the rules and, put forth a vision of what we would like to see, but ultimately people will make individual decisions, about what they want to do with their property. And I think, this is all plans that we make they're living documents, they're organic. There's always opportunity to revisit and see what's working, what's not working. And I think what became very clear is the standards are very confusing. There is this overall vision of the area. And again, this is not a repeal of the Bergamot area plan or an elimination. It's not that at all. It's just that how can we encourage, more new investment, new development in this area that is meeting the city's goals, given the new reality we're in. When we did this plan over 10 years ago, we didn't have a 6-cycle housing element. We didn't have all of these, state laws that
Overlays.
got passed in 2017, right? So we're trying to deal with these new realities and bring this plan up to date, but still very much hanging on to the principles that were set forth in the loose, and in the area plan.
And just to tag on to that, what's really interesting about Bergamot, that, obviously the whole city is interesting, but Bergamot is a little bit different because the parcel sizes tend to be larger, and the street grid in many places, as you can see in the diagram in the purple, and this area in the orange, the street grid is at a slightly different orientation. So that changes the orientation for solar and wind access. And as Jing was saying, when we did the Bergamot area plan, we didn't anticipate buildings that were more than 20 stories tall. And so this is a really good opportunity for us to look at what that might look like for Santa Monica and how we might want to shape those towers. So I think what we heard so far is that there may be agreement in providing a definition of a high rise that might be, say, 11 or 12 stories. But this is a lot of information. We anticipate y'all will want to think about that. And then Jing, do we want to talk a little bit more about tower massing and how that is regulated or might be regulated?
Yeah, but I see Strachan has his hand raised, so yeah.
kind of dovetails into moving to discuss the floor plate size slightly. On your slide, I think you mentioned Vancouver has a maximum floor plate size of 5,500 square feet. I actually think it's 6,500 square feet. So you might just want to check that. But
that's helpful. Thank you.
But I think it's a little bit of a dangerous precedent as well. I mean, I think the skyline in Vancouver looks spectacular, but they have very different building codes there. And so when San Francisco did its Rincon Hill plan, probably a couple of decades ago at this point, they looked to Vancouver to figure out if there was a floor plate size that made sense. But when they analyzed the code in Canada versus the CBC in California, there are elements that we have to include, like stair separation, fire service access elevators, smoke vestibules, and the ADA requirements within the unit that make the floor plates less efficient in California versus Vancouver. So in San Francisco, they set the floor plate size for Rincon Hill at 10,000 square feet. But the feedback after that whole district was built out with towers was that that still wasn't quite enough to make an efficient floor plate in the 80-ish, 83% range efficiency. So San Francisco has now moved to 12,000 as the standard floor plate size in the Central SOMA plan and some of the newer plans for towers. I just wanted to give you that as a kind of data point.
That's helpful.
Is that
yeah.
for residential?
Yeah, residential. It is, yeah, residential.
Okay, Susan, do you want to speak to some of the things that AECOM had found regarding floor plate?
Yeah, well, interesting. It's helpful because it definitely lines up with what you've said. As often a kind of maximum efficiency is around 12,000, 12,500. Often that architects and developers are trying to target. Vancouver was kind of shockingly small when we first saw the standards, so probably not something that we'd end up recommending, but really interesting to see just how small that footprint was. Helpful to know about Rincon Hill in San Francisco. So yeah, I think we're in alignment that most likely it wouldn't make sense to have a much smaller floor plate size than say 12,000, or maybe it would end up being larger, just based on feasibility and, as you mentioned, building codes and things like that.
I guess for the group, I'm wondering if there's more of an interest in regulating tower shape than actual floor plate size for the towers. And if we were to do that, would there be a maximum width? I think we were looking at 70 to 80 feet for the maximum width, understanding that you need space for the core and then a depth of, say, two units, which would be about 25 feet each in depth. So are there any thoughts on that? Strachan?
Yeah, so when we work a lot on high-rise projects, and they typically fall into two basic configurations, either a bar tower, which is more rectangular, and in that case, double loaded with a corridor in the middle, then the 70 to 80 foot is the right ballpark for the width of the tower. The other configuration is what we call a point tower, which is a squarer configuration with the core in the middle and then the units wrapped around on all sides of the core. And in that configuration, the floor plate is often about 105 to 115 by 105 to 115. So it ends up being quite square. So if you restricted to 70 to 80 in one direction, that would preclude point towers. And the great thing about point towers is, the bar tower looks very slender from one direction, but actually creates a slab in the other direction and has a bigger shadow impact than a point tower. So I'd just be cautious about precluding point towers. It's a very I think good.
And 115, 100 to 115 sounds a little bit, sounds fairly wide for a point tower, particularly if it's only going to be about 20 to 24 stories tall. So what's your experience with the proportionality and the shade, shadow, et cetera, on a tower that size?
Yeah, so if you are thinking about a 12,000 foot plate in a point tower configuration, that's about 110 by 110, gets you just over 12,000.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, and again, I think you know, if you do a similar bar tower that's 12,000 divided by 75, then that's 160 foot long. So it will really depend on the site configuration, but sometimes these bars, if they're 160 foot long and that's along the east-west orientation, you can imagine that's creating a lot of shadow in comparison to a point tower at 110 by 110 would create less shadow.
Right. Okay. Okay. And the point towers that are about that size, how tall are those towers that you have experience with so far?
Yeah, the point tower, the bar tower is more efficient overall. So generally, below a certain height, it doesn't make sense to do a point tower. This is a lot of information. But to Jesse's
Below
point,
what height would you say doesn't make sense to do a point tower?
Again, it will depend on the site configuration. I mean, some sites just lend themselves, the geometry of the site lends itself better to a point tower configuration. But generally, we don't really see many point towers below, 250 feet.
I see.
Generally, more 300, 350, 400 and above. It's very structurally efficient, the point tower as well. But to Jesse's point about height, I know that height is often of concern to neighborhoods when they hear high numbers in terms of height. But if we are trying to keep tower separation and porosity of the block and maintaining sky plane and limiting shadows, then the height is advantageous. If you can go taller but keep the floor plates smaller, then the shadow moves more quickly across the landscape, and you actually get less shadow impact on the neighborhood.
And if we were to have, let's say, a limitation on the length of a bar tower, so that we could have, for walkability's sake, if we were to have a limitation of, say, 120 or 150 feet long on a bar tower, that would be too short, it sounds like, for your bar towers?
Well, if you allowed up to 80 feet and a 12,000 plate, then that would be about 150. Yeah.
Okay.
It's on the shorter end, I'd say. I think Oakland limits to 180. San Jose allows very big floor plates, and I think their limit is much longer. But yeah, we often are working in that 160 to 180 on the bar tower.
Okay, and that's about 80 feet wide.
75 to 80, depending on depending on the other thing I think is the unit's size, and which obviously has to be market driven. I think that going back to Vancouver, they often have much smaller unit size than we have in the California market. Mm-hmm. And that can drive the depth of the bar towers and the point towers as well.
I thought generally the depth of your residential unit was 25, no more than 30 feet, so you could get light into the unit.
32 works pretty well.
Okay.
As we go to smaller and smaller units for affordability, then that does want to decrease, but that hurts the efficiency at a certain point for the tower.
Okay, that's helpful. Jesse, I think we saw your hand raised again, and Samuel.
Yeah, I thought I'd just I think on some of those points, in terms of the unit depth, yeah, 25 does seem a little small in terms of like setting that as a standard for determining the width of the project, because it does depend on the unit size of it's market driven, and depends on the type of layouts as well. So having some more flexibility there. I'm just looking at a project that you'll be seeing shortly, and it's a point tower that's not quite a square, but it's a little bit longer, and we've got to a smaller floor plate on this one, and it we are above the 80 feet. I think we're like at around 90 because we have a little bit deeper units than where we're at, and then we're like 120 feet in the other direction. But I would say part of it depends on the site orientation and the like in the downtown. And I know we're not talking about downtown, but it's usually by the parcel size and how many lots that there are, and then that has an impact on the shape. And in Bergamot, the lots are often different sizes and different shapes as well. So there may be instances where you could have one tower that's maybe a little bit bigger to get the units, whereas if the standards are more narrow, it might become infeasible to then build two towers that then have the separation and then have the smaller sizes. So I think that's I don't have an answer for that. I just pointing that out. I think these are going to be some of the challenges with setting these. And what was the other thing I was going to mention? I think that's it for now. But yeah, I think those are all really good points that Strachan made.
And what's the depth? You mentioned that you're working on a project that has a little bit deeper residential unit. What's the depth you're working with? Is it deeper than 32?
No, it's about that 32, but the 25s are pretty narrow.
Okay.
And then it needs more window wall. Like if you wanted to do a 700 square foot one bedroom, you need a lot more width. So that's where you don't necessarily need the width, you need the depth to have a more efficient unit.
Okay, that's helpful. So it does sound like we do want standards for when these kick in, a maximum floor plate or size of floor plate. Seems like there's openness to that. And are we hearing also support for tower separation as well? So the point of the tower separation is to try to make sure we're getting light down to the ground, and that when you look up, you don't only see building, that you can still see sky.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, from my perspective, I think the tower separation does make sense. I think like the example shown, those towers were all way too close together, and it was, I think to that point, it just really needs to go up so that the towers are further apart and you have less of a shadow impact. So I think having some standards there. I think the challenge is just the size of the site, and some of these sites may not lay out and be exactly specific to fitting a standard. So if there is some, I don't know, in the objective standards, if there's any way to have leeway or something that's built into how that's treated, or the minimum not being too restrictive. But I think it makes sense to have some of those regulated for sure, because it then helps us with the layouts and what we need to go by.
Can I just ask a question for Jesse and Strachan here? Just thinking about these standards, and like you're saying, like, I think sort of like the feasibility kind of plays in here. And I'm just wondering, if there were to be standards around like floor plate separation, in the interest of like mitigating these sort of like, sky exposure, sun shadow impacts and the like, is there sort of like a maximum height limit? I'm just thinking about that trade-off between the spacing between buildings and then going up to like make up, as you're saying, like for the loss of units, just to make it feasible. Like, are you seeing a limit from your clients? Like, I think that's, that's, I think, something helpful for us to understand a little bit as well.
I'll mention a couple of, like, there are building code height levels where other controls in the building code kick in.
Okay.
For example, beyond 240 feet, we have to go through a different structural prescriptive, there's performance and prescriptive structural design. So that's the point that transitions.
Mm-hmm.
Above 400 feet, you typically have to use a different, for OSHA, like a different cleaning system for the building facades, which adds a lot of cost. So so often you see like planning codes set building heights at like 250, but 250 is like an arbitrary number that we wouldn't do. We would do 240 or we'd go to 280 because 250 is. So there are some considerations like that when it comes to height, but generally once you're in type 1 high rise and you've got an efficient floor plate, the higher the better from the developer's perspective in terms of efficiency and delivering units.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, so it sounds like tower spacing, and we understand that all of these, if they're not, we have to find the sweet spot so they're not that they lead to feasible buildings. Are we ready to go on to facade design? Is there a sense that from the group that there's an interest in some facade design standards, potentially requiring some balconies, some vertical elements, something to give the tower visual interest? Samuel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think we should be closer if we're going to pick a size for a plate, that we should be closer to the Vancouver standards, and we'll get better quality given the lots that we have to work with, variable lot sizes. We'll get a better design from that standard or something closer to that than 10,000, 12,000 square feet. It's just my feeling. If you're going to design, if you're going to put that requirement in there, we better be less than than places like San Francisco or we'll get better designs.
Well, thank you for that. So for the group, are we ready to move on to tower articulation, facade design? Are there any thoughts on this section? Bob. Bob, you may be muted if you're talking. We can't hear you. We still can't hear you.
There we go. Oh. We hear you now, Bob, I think.
Relative to the last few comments about not just plate size, et cetera. These are all important factors, but I do want to know, based on prior projects that have occurred in the city, who amongst the participants here are under contract to design projects in the Bergamot area at this time. I don't think it's a restriction on their participation, but I think it would be useful, at least to me, to understand who's motivating direction here and for what purpose. Anybody?
Well, Bob, I think, I don't know the answer to that. I also know
No, but
that
others do.
we have a variety of developers in the city, and we anticipate that this
I
is
know.
not there's not the only that the folks that we have doing applications in Bergamot may not be the only folks who might be interested in doing towers in Santa Monica.
Well, clearly, that's true. What I'm wondering about is because we're sitting here attempting to guide criteria, which will ultimately dictate or set parameters, who currently is contributing to that has vested interest. That's not an unreasonable question, nor does it exclude them from participation. Anybody?
Well, I can offer just personally, I'm not involved in any projects currently that would be subject to these controls.
You know, well, we saw, unfortunately, a problem with this on other projects. So that's what my interest is in clarifying that. I don't know if it's of interest to anyone, but relative to an exchange in emails that I had with Jason Perry during the Bergamot planning in 2010, I can post that there if you like, which focused on height and the purpose of height and design. So I'll post it. You can read through it if you're interested. Somewhat pertinent to where we're at here. From one additional comment I would make relative to, I know we're designing objective design standards, which is why I asked that, but I would think hopefully as creative architects, we find our way to create creative solutions, though I know that we're all beaten over the head by the developer profits. Okay, that's my comment.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
I think what what we're all here to do is to try to find a way to help guide the best designs that are also feasible, so that we continue to encourage development in the city, and that it's right for the city.
Can I comment on that to you then? If that is the case, what we're dealing with here is essentially the housing requirements. And of those 60% or plus that are supposed to be affordable and low income or for lower income, what criteria is being presented to justify any of the additional heights and the densities? Because I've never seen the requirements. I know the RINA numbers. I see them dictated. I know the state dictates. I'm not naive. I understand those. But from our perspective as a community and as a city and as professionals, where is the criteria that establishes? Because according to the state numbers from the Department of Finance, for example, the population in Santa Monica declined 2,000 to 4,000 over the last 4 years. Similarly in the county and the state. So would it not be pertinent to have specific criteria that stipulates the need to solve a problem that we're creating rather than solving, it seems to me?
Yeah.
Do they exist?
So Bob, yeah, I mean, I don't want us to get sidetracked here from the purpose of the working group today. And I'm happy to have a further conversation with you about it.
Sure.
Outside of the group, because it's sort of, I want to respect everybody's time who took their time to be here this morning. So I'm more than happy to have a conversation about the state laws and the housing element. I mean, I think the short answer is, we the projects we're seeing, that are of this scale, it's not something that we have, that the city has a choice to say, no, that's not allowed. State law allows the proposals of these projects. We have a lot of constraints around, the ability to shape housing projects. So as Stephanie indicated, we're here because we have the proposals we have, and it's necessitating a need to have this conversation around, if we're going to have proposals of this scale, what can we do to shape them, and understanding that we are walking a balance here between ensuring that all of the principles, in our long-range policy documents are being applied here, but melding them together, with what the city is required to comply with. So I appreciate your perspective. And again, I'm happy to have a conversation about it, but I do want to make sure that we get back to what, we were here today with respect to this working group.
Thanks, Jing. I appreciate that. I just
All right.
noticed the scales are tipped, that's all.
Yeah, understood. Shall we go back to on facade design? Did anyone have any comments or feedback about whether there should be requirements for facade articulation? We can keep moving through if not.
So
podium
maybe
massing?
yeah,
Okay.
podium massing. So what we've heard is that it would be good to have some maximum sizes for towers, definition of where the tower starts, and tower spacing. Towers often sit on podiums, and the podium is what we would relate to at the ground level, and podium size would dictate where we would be able to move through the Bergamot area. So as we'd like to talk a little bit about podium massing, do we have any thoughts so far on podium massing and podium size?
And I think, Stephanie, we want to point out here that as we were looking at this consideration, we were recognizing, I think, that this is similar concepts to what we've already discussed with respect to street wall standards, sort of what I'll just call the regular standards, if you will. Especially when we think about even the potential for above ground parking through this project, we have developed standards in that regard. And we thought there may be not too much different here, but I think we would love to definitely get feedback from a group of whether that is your thoughts around that, whether we should kind of circle back and take a look at this again.
So
with respect to this typology.
Yeah, so to clarify, I mean, I think that there's maybe we could put our principles or design standards into two broad categories. One is the size and shape of the podium and podium massing, potentially height, but we typically won't regulate that. And then the other is the street wall or the surface of the podium and how that interacts with the pedestrian. So how much glass there is, how much articulation there might be. So as Jing was mentioning, we typically have some good standards started for that latter set of standards, how the podium or how the design relates to the street and its transparency and what features it might have. We would also like to get some feedback on size of podium, because that's not something that we have
Well, it looks like Stephanie froze, but I think what she was
I
saying
can kind
was,
of add
go
to
ahead,
that.
Susan.
We'd love to get feedback on, podium footprint, kind of maximum or size. And obviously it really relates to the lot coverage, but because the idea is if you have a really large lot, that we wouldn't want the entire podium to cover the lot. Also wouldn't allow enough space within the project potentially to create a pathway through some of these, because in Bergamot, as we mentioned before, there's some very large blocks that would benefit from having some more pedestrian pathways, either for people in the public if they're open, or just people on site to be able to navigate within the blocks. And there are some partial pathways that exist. So really just thinking about that as a potential aim, and what your thoughts are relative to podium and podium size.
Any thoughts from the group?
And also what's, certainly parking, but what's really driving the decisions to do a podium format versus entirely underground parking, and what the dynamics might be there related to feasibility and what counts towards FAR. So if you have any comments there, we'd welcome them.
Looks like Mario, you have your hand up. And George, we haven't heard from you yet. So Mario and then George. Mario, we
Mario, it
can't hear
appears
you.
you are muted, Mario.
Sorry about that. What I was saying is that whatever standards we have for the podium articulation, it should be scaled to the height of the podium. You know, if you have a 2-foot setback on a 40-foot high podium, it's virtually invisible. You're not going to see it. It's not going to work to define a segment or an edge. So whatever standards we impose, they should be scaled to the height of the object.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you very much. George, you had your hand up?
Yeah, my only comment here is with regards to these pedestrian corridors, the main concern obviously would be just security and you know, if you're opening up your property and your development to the public, you know, the responsibility to maintain that and ensure that it's kept safe is a big question. Obviously, there's been some challenges in the downtown area and not so much in the Bergamot, but you know, you're essentially being required, if you have these pedestrian corridors, to give your property to the city. And so I just would like to bring up that, you know, that issue as far as, you know, who's responsible for maintaining the security of that area. Is it being taken as an easement for public right of way? In which case there should be some compensation to the property owner. And like the maintenance obligations of that space, I think are kind of critical in understanding whether that would be feasible.
Well, thanks, George, for that question. Since this is a very new concept, we don't anticipate that we would require that. We couldn't require that to be public property. We wouldn't be taking an easement. We would likely request to the developer property owner that those pathways be maintained and be maintained to be open during daylight hours or business hours. We certainly couldn't require them to be open at night because you're right, security is an issue, and the city wouldn't be purchasing those or requiring those as easements, so we wouldn't be requiring them to be open at night.
Okay, thank you. Just the concern there is just the maintenance of that. If it is open to the public and you have, I'm not saying that the typical resident of Santa Monica would be someone we'd be concerned about with vandalism, but you're right next to this expo line stop. And so if you have people coming through the space and damaging property, et cetera, that can just create additional liability, especially if it's on your private property. It's just an issue to be addressed.
Thank you for that. Any other thoughts on podium size and design? Sounds like there's interest in having some cut-throughs in the podium rather than having these large blocks being taken up entirely by a podium. I hope that I have that right. Any other thoughts on that? Oh, Kara.
I don't have much experience with high-rise buildings, but my only thought, just thinking through this, is if there is podium parking, having a cut through that would have to be open to the sky might be an issue. So I don't think ground floor cut throughs would be an issue for parking and circulation, but you know, if it was required open to the sky, then you do have limitations on parking and circulation. You would have to essentially build 2 separate buildings.
If you were doing a podium that you were using for parking, what would be an optimal size?
Interesting. I mean, usually you would want to do like a quad, 2 double loaded corridors for parking. So it depends on the size of the lot. I don't know, it would be whatever, your 18 feet plus 25-foot drive aisle plus 18 plus 18 plus 25 plus 18 for circulation.
Right. So 236 and 225. So yeah, that's about 125. So if we were to shape or have some maximums that would allow for parking at a 125, 130, or even 150, then we could get, there's a potential at 150 to get a walkable network if we've got pass-throughs in between. That's super helpful. Thank you.
I think part of that also is, you know, as we've heard about these standards relative to parcel size, of course, you know, if it makes sense.
Great. So is it would it be good to move on to solar?
I had a comment.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead,
I was trying to
Jesse.
raise my hand, but I don't know if I came through. The only thing I was going to say on terms of podium size, and I have a comment on this street wall as well, is just to work with the fire department in terms of there's a lot of sites in the Bergamot that back up and don't have alley access and are either on the, you know, backing up to the train or backing up to some other areas that aren't through because it's not the same as kind of the downtown lots. So just some of these requirements that may restrict podium may not work well with fire, or the proportions or that sort of thing in terms of the fire department access to these. So I think that's the only thing I would just point out, is that if there are restrictions on these, that it would be good maybe to be thinking about that in terms of fire access as well.
That's helpful. Thank you. And then you wanted to talk about facade design?
Yeah, and just on the on the ground floor, on the podium, how it meets the street. I think one of the things, I might have said this in the past, but I think one of the things that I like about the Bergamot plan versus the downtown plan is that flexibility to, you know, there's the frontage line, and Bergamot gives you some space to create landscaping or some other setbacks at entries that the downtown, really the 70% of that building has to be at that building frontage line, or we're not in compliance unless it's a code required setback for an entry, right? So I think having that flexibility is really nice, especially if we're talking about that ground floor street level experience, especially on these bigger lots as well, like keeping those standards. And I don't know if you were planning on changing those or not, but I do like the Bergamot allowing us to be within a certain distance of the building frontage line.
So you'd rather, it's more flexible for you if there's a certain distance, let's say 10 feet from the frontage line, rather than the requirement to have 70% at the frontage line and 30% can be 10 feet.
Because to be honest, I think we struggle with that in terms of design, in terms of like some of those like meeting the requirements don't always give us that flexibility to then have designs that the city's happy with in terms of how the pedestrian experience is.
Just to clarify, I think you're talking about in both dimensions, right? So not just the 50, 70, 80%, whatever that is of the lot frontage, but then also the setback itself, so that you might have a little bit of flex, like if the setback is a 0 lot line or 5 foot, you still have maybe 5 feet of flexibility in that setback.
Because then we can bring design into it, and it's like if you want to have some kind of outdoor space that sets back in a little bit further from that frontage line, but it still meets the spirit of creating that street wall. Does it matter if it's at the frontage line or 8 or 10 feet back, and you can still have that really nice experience, or have more landscaping or that sort of thing.
Thanks.
So the average works better, you think, than the specific?
Yeah,
frontage?
I can see that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So are we ready to talk a little bit about solar and wind? We didn't want to necessarily ask for wind studies. Apparently, there aren't that many wind consultants to go to. Solar studies are pretty easy to do. So Susan, do you want to talk a little bit about, we do have all these diagrams. did you come to some idea about optimum location and spacing? Well, we talked about spacing earlier, but location and orientation for shade, shadow, and wind.
Yeah, I mean, definitely don't have a recommendation at this point, but I would be interested in hearing from the group about when you're thinking about designing your open space and what the potential shadow impacts are. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share about whether you're trying to typically maximize sun exposure, or in Santa Monica, whether you're also trying to include shade at certain times of the year, and any thoughts you have there about what objectives you've been trying to achieve when designing buildings here, given the local climate.
Okay, well, you know, we haven't had tall buildings like this, as Jing had said at the outset, in quite some time. I think it's early for us to all be thinking about this kind of type of standard. It's possible that folks on the call, and we're really grateful you spent a good portion of your morning with us, we need to digest this information and come back to us. Jing, do you want to talk? Is it time to talk about next steps?
I
I
would
think
just say
so.
on the
Oh, yeah,
shadow,
go ahead.
just quickly
okay.
on the shadow, like
Yes.
you had, like, if we looked at, yeah, the 2A versus 2B, 2B would be the preference because you're pushing, you know, more of the open space has got better southern exposure. However, you know, often the building placement is driven by lots of different considerations, you know, how it relates to the parking, the urban fabric. So we always try and optimize the exposure, but we're often balancing a lot of different competing criteria.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
Shadow's a hard one to be to come up with like an objective design standard, I think, because it's so, you know, how much shadow is acceptable is you know, they tried to do that in San Francisco, and it's been frankly a nightmare.
Well, I guess the other question is, are we yet at the point where it's preferable to have shade in the open space? Because sometimes the sun can get to be a little much. I'm very fair-skinned, and I always like to have a little shade. I think also what we're thinking is that if towers or buildings that are rectangular in shape have their short side in the east and east-west direction, and the long side in the north-south direction, that might lead to more space for views. Susan, do I have that right, or do I have that opposite?
I was, sorry, feverishly typing what Strachan was just saying. But yeah, in terms of views, just thinking about the profile of the building and the direction of, you know, where you're trying to see a particular view. But what were you saying, Stephanie? Sorry, because I was taking
so
notes.
if we wanted to say preserve not a specific view, but if you're looking up and north, which is where some of the views might be, would a preferable orientation be to have your rectangular buildings oriented so that the short side is facing north-south and the long side is east-west? So if we wanted to prioritize the building orientation, we would prioritize this orientation or this orientation. Do we have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it's tricky because, yeah, if you have the slender part facing towards the north, I'd have to look more specifically at where the mountains are exactly, but you might get better orientation with the kind of slender side facing like towards the ocean, because then you kind of get the long side and the slender side facing the mountains. So potentially, but I'd have to look very specifically with the mountains in the foreground. But and whether people are able to look at out the side of their balcony versus just considering those that have like the direct impact view of the mountains, for example.
Yeah, I'm thinking it would be more for the space between the buildings rather than the occupants in the buildings.
In terms of blocking their views, yeah.
In terms of creating space in the north-south direction in a way. So that's maybe something we want to take a look at. Any other thoughts before we talk about next steps? Okay, so Samuel, did you have something you wanted to share?
No.
Okay. So here we are, April 18th. Thank you again for joining us. Tonight we'll have a similar discussion with the full Architectural Review Board. Planning Commission, we will be having a discussion on May 8th, and we would probably like to arrange for another discussion with this group between now and then. So if you could watch for correspondence regarding another meeting, say at the very end of April or beginning of May. We haven't quite looked at the calendar to schedule it, but we do think some of these ideas may need to be digested a bit so that we could get a little bit more feedback from this group. Feedback from this group is extremely valuable to the process. We'll be going to City Council with a study session for them, incorporating all the comments we've heard from this group, from the ARB and from Planning Commission, going back to Planning Commission for a recommendation on July 17th. And potentially we'll have another meeting with the working group in there. And then we have a deadline to meet for City Council adoption on September 24th. That's just a different graphic of the same information. So I think that I'll stop sharing my screen so we can see everyone who's still on the call. And Jing, do you have any thoughts? Or
no, I just want to again thank everybody for participating today. As Stephanie said, we didn't anticipate we would, this was a lot of information today, so we just really appreciate the preliminary feedback, that you were all able to provide, and we'll be calendaring another working group meeting, as Stephanie said. We just haven't landed on a date. We want to kind of see how today's meeting went, and then just seeing where we land on our next meeting. But it will be probably in the next couple weeks, 2-ish weeks or so, and we will let the group know when that will be. So again, thank you all so much for taking the time this morning, afternoon, I guess. Really appreciate it, and we will see you again next time.
I appreciate the engagement.
Yeah,
all right.
thank you
so
so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Recording.